Thank you.
Well, stay with us here on World Inside. Our final segment is straight ahead. Cameron victorious. The UK Conservatives defy the opinion polls, clinching a majority in Parliament. Stay with us. Welcome back to World Insight. Now we go to the United Kingdom, where Conservative Party leader David Cameron has swept to an unprecedented victory in the country's general election. Predictions of a close race with Labour rival Ed Miliband turned out to be way off the mark. Labour ended polling night in tatters, overwhelmed by a nationalist movement in Scotland some have dubbed the Scottish tsunami. Despite the unexpectedly decisive outcome, more uncertainty looms over whether Britain will stay in the Eurozone and in the European Union. Now let's take a look.
Back and stronger than before, British Prime Minister and Conservative Party leader David Cameron has been returned to power for another 5 years, after his party won a majority in the House of Commons on the back of gains in England and Wales.
I've just been to see Her Majesty the Queen, and I will now form a majority Conservative government. I've been proud to lead the first coalition government in 70 years, and I want to thank all those who worked so hard to make it a success.
A disappointing result for Labour and leader Ed Miliband, who has resigned from the party's top job, speaking before the confirmed results.
Now, the results are still coming in, but this has clearly been a very disappointing and difficult night for the Labour Party. We haven't made the gains we wanted in England and Wales, and in Scotland we've seen a surge of nationalism overwhelm our party.
Labour's pain was the Scottish Nationalist Party's gain. Nationalists won almost every seat up north, a result likely to stoke momentum for Scottish independence after a referendum seeking to separate Scotland from the rest of the UK last year failed. A Conservative majority means Cameron no longer needs the Liberal Democrats, with which he has governed since 2010. The centre-left party was crushed, going from 57 MPs to single digits, its leader also standing down.
Turning to the national picture, it is now painfully clear that this has been a cruel and punishing night for the Liberal Democrats.
Britons will likely vote on whether to leave the European Union within 2 years, with Cameron promising an in-out referendum to be held by 2017. The other major issue facing the country is the economy. The UK is now one of the fastest growing economies in Europe, with a growth rate of 2.6% last year, and unemployment is low compared to the rest of the continent, and the Conservative Party's economic plan, bending cuts to pay down the country's whopping deficit, has been endorsed by the International Monetary Fund. So a decisive victory for the Conservatives, but one which throws up many challenges for David Cameron. Not just paying down debt and keeping Britain in the European Union, also keeping the country together as one United Kingdom.
For more on that surprising Tory victory, we are joined in the studio by John Ross, a Labour supporter and the author of the critical book on the Conservatives called Thatcher and Friends, The Anatomy of the Tory Party. He is now a senior fellow at the Chongyang Institute of Renmin University. In New York, we have Brian Cattell, a former parliamentary candidate for the Conservatives and former chairman of the conservative think tank, The Bold Group. Welcome to World Insight. My first question is start with you, Mr. Ross. Why there's been such a big mismatch of the opinion polls and the final results? Are we counting the right sample sizes, the wrong sample sizes, or the voters are just not decided at that time?
Well, I think tactically the election is a tremendous triumph for the Tory party. The coalition party has lost 14% of the vote from 58 to 44%, and the Tories arranged for 100% of that to be lost to the Liberal Democrats. The actual vote for the Tories is not terribly far off the polls. It's 36.7, and the polls in general were 35. What is clear is the Labour Party very significantly underperformed. The Tories therefore have the largest, they're the smallest proportion of the vote for a majority in Parliament since 1922, so that's for 93 years. So tactically it's a tremendous success for them, it doesn't alter the general relation of forces which exist in Britain.
Mr. Cattell, does it come out of your expectations, or you see that coming?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question again?
Did you see that victory coming in your way, in the Tories' way?
I didn't. I think it surprised everyone, not just the Conservatives themselves, but I think all commentators. I think it's an historic and it's an extraordinary victory in many ways. I think that in a way the country pulled back from the brink, because if you think about how people were viewing this internationally in the days leading up to the poll, there were real fears that we would see fragmentation, that we would have days, weeks, perhaps even months of uncertainty as to whether a government could be formed. So I think this is it is unexpected, but I think it's a huge plus for the country. You can see the way the markets have reacted today, the way that sterling is shooting through the roof in the stock market. So it's a very positive result for the country.
Well, 5 years after surviving a difficult coalition, would this be the British public saying that they had enough with coalition government, or is it just the Scots coming back to England?
I think it's not a reaction as such to the coalition that we had, but what I think happened is that people were, and why we have this mismatch between the polls and the actual result, is that people were genuinely undecided leading into this. And I think, as happened in 1992, in the privacy of the polling booth, people pulled back from the brink, and in many ways this was quite a sober, pragmatic vote for continuity and for a continuation of policies that have been successful, that, as your intro pointed out, have led to economic growth. But the recovery is fragile, and I think people didn't want to put that at risk.
Well, let's look at some numbers, which is quite interesting. The voting patterns and how things have changed since 2010. Now, UKIP has gained the most, almost 10%. Labour's gained at 1.4%, while the Conservatives have gained just 0.8%. The big loser, the Lib Dems, with a 15% swing against them. Well, gentlemen, can you try and put these numbers in perspective for us? Despite only that one very small gain, the Conservatives got 21 seats?
Yes, but it's because of the...
I think it's a reflection of the... Sorry, go ahead. You go ahead.
It's the collapse of the Liberal Democrats. I mean, the Tories succeeded in annihilating the Liberal Democrats. I say, the fall in the support for the coalition party from 58% to 44%, loss of 14%, is a huge loss of votes. The Tory tactical success was that they didn't lose at all. And all of the loss was taken by the Liberal Democrats. That is very clever tactics, but it doesn't alter the fact that the policies of the coalition were tremendously unpopular, as was shown by the actual fall in the total vote.
Mr. Cattell, what were you saying?
Well, I think it's right that the coalition was very unpopular, which makes it even more extraordinary that Labour wasn't able to make any kind of progress. In fact, I think it has fewer seats now than were achieved under Gordon Brown in 2010. So I think that obviously the difference between the popular vote and the seats is a reflection of Britain's distinctive political system, the first past the post system. The Conservatives didn't massively increase their share of the popular vote, but where they were able to succeed were in the swing seats, where people weren't particularly partisan. You know, the percentage of people who are partisan supporters of either Labour, Conservative or any party is at an historic low. Therefore, to win elections in Britain, you have to really hold the centre ground with pragmatic, sensible policies. And I think in the final analysis, the Conservatives managed to get that message across, and I think people made a sensible choice.
Let's talk about Scotland for a minute. Mr. Cattell, a party that has campaigned for Scottish independence for 80 years has swept to a victory. We call it a Scottish tsunami or avalanche, whatever you want to call it. They have just lost 3 seats in the north. Isn't that a clear call, a clear message to David Cameron?
There's no doubt it's a huge challenge, and it's one of the top challenges facing the incoming Conservative government, because it's a fundamental battle of ideas between those led by the Conservatives, but by the way supported by the other major UK Westminster parties, those who believe in the Union, those who believe in keeping the United Kingdom together, those who believe that Scots, but not just Scots, English people, Welsh people, Ulster people, benefit from being together in a greater whole. that argument has to be made. And there are a number of ways in which the government will, the Westminster government will need to address that. Delivering on promises of greater devolution is going to be critically important. But I think wider than that, really addressing the painful issue of how the British people as a whole feel towards the EU, continuing the economic recovery. The growth is strong, but it's an early stage, fragile recovery. And as that economy continues to grow, then I think the romantic pangs for national separatism will probably die down, because prosperity is the greatest salve of nationalism.
Well, let's talk about economic policy later, but I want to know, Mr. Ross, what does it say to you? Is the union still in place? Will it end in the future?
Well, I think that everything will be done to try to prevent there being another referendum, because I think the Tories have lost Scotland. The Tories' vote started to go down in Scotland in 1959. At one time, just after the Second World War, they were the largest party in Scotland. Now they're a sect. They also did very badly in London, which is a big working class conurbation, where the vote went to Labour. So the Tories have now become a rural and south of England party outside of London. It's very difficult to hold the country together on that basis, and therefore but the way that will be done is, I think, is try to avoid referendum, but this will lead to further backlashes against the situation. So I think for the first time, yes, the unity of the United Kingdom has become in play, yes.
But many are also arguing that if Labour still wants a seat in the north, it wouldn't be Conservatives anyway.
It won't get it won't get the north back. In my opinion, the defeat of Labour by the SNP is a historic defeat. I don't expect Labour to get any significant number of seats back. But on the other hand, it doesn't take very much swing for Labour to take seats for the Tories, because in England it's Labour against the Tories, and don't forget, every seat that Labour wins under that is a gain of 2 seats. So it's perfectly possible, if the polls had been accurate, that is, if Labour, I don't think the Tories did actually greatly overperform the polls. What is very clear is Labour considerably underperformed the polls. If the Labour had done as well as the polls indicated, they would have won even in the situation in England. So I don't think it blocks a Labour government, no.
Let's talk about UKIP. Well, before the election, before the poll station opens, they were reported to be gaining much more grounds than they are showing in election results, and they have only got 1 seat, and the leader, Nigel Farage, has lost his election. How would you explain this?
Well, I think it's because their seat's not in the right place. This is a peculiarity of the English electoral, British electoral system. They have 3.8 million votes and 1 seat. I'm strongly opposed to UKIP. But from the point of view of democracy, this is a scandal. And the election system is not going to survive. If you can have a majority in Parliament with 36.8% of the vote, and a party which just gets 3.8 million votes gets 1 seat, that's going to disappear. In Britain, things normally take longer than you expect due to our long historical tradition, but it's only a matter of time before the electoral system's replaced. One of the expressions of that being what happened to UKIP.
Mr. Cattell, would you agree that the electoral system should be reviewed?
I think over the longer term it should be looked at. I think that's right. I think that it is a system which has been in place for a very long time, and I think as we, in this century, some of the recent elections, this election obviously and the last election, are showing that the system is not reflective fully of the will of the people. And I think the UKIP case is a very interesting one, because UKIP actually performed very strongly in many ways in terms of the number of votes that they won, but they won lots of second places in the north. They succeeded in territory that the Conservatives struggle in, to be frank, and I think for the sake of democracy, taking a step back from party politics, the system does have to be looked at over the longer term. But what the solutions are, remember we had a referendum pushed by the Liberal Democrats, but under the last coalition government, for a rather watered down form of proportional representation, and that fell flat. So what the way forward is, I'm not sure, and I don't think it's anything that's going to happen quickly, unfortunately. There are other priorities and other referenda coming not least the European Union.
Mr. Ross, where does the Labour go from this? Many are worried they will never recover again.
No.
Would you worry the same thing?
I'm not the slightest bit worried about that. People said in 1983, when the Labour suffered an even worse defeat, they were not going to recover. And then from 1997 till 2010, they were in power continuously with enormous majorities. People are continuously declaring that either the Conservative Party is finished or the Labour Party is finished, and it doesn't happen. The key question, which I think for Labour, was that they present themselves in Scotland as to the right of the SNP. The most catastrophic of all the mistakes was the decision to hug the Tories during the Scottish referendum campaign. Labour could have campaigned in favour of the Union, but done so separately from the Tories. Their decision to tie themselves in the campaign to the Tories, when the Tories are hated in Scotland, as you can see by the result, was one of the biggest strategic mistakes made in recent British political history, and Labour suffered a tremendous price as a result of that.
Let's wait another 5 years to see.
If I could just come...
Yeah, very quick. We're running out of time.
Okay, sorry, I just wanted to say, look, I think this, obviously this has been a big disaster for Labour, and I think it raises serious questions about how the party's organised, because the candidate that failed so spectacularly was chosen by the unions, not by the rank and file of the party, and a far more qualified candidate who's now here in New York, his brother, was cast aside. And I think Labour's going to have to look at that and reform if it wants to challenge again for power in the UK.
Thank you, Brian, and also thank you, Mr. John Ross. Well, and that's all we have for today. If you'd like to see more, you can visit our website. Just type World Insight CCTV News into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. I'm Wang Jin, Beijing. For myself and all the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and join us again on Monday for more global perspectives and stories from across China and around the world. Goodbye for now.